Cathara stood motionless among the trees, her bronze feathers blending perfectly with the bark and shadows around her. She had been tracking the sacred elk for 3 days, observing its patterns and movements as part of her duty, but she had not come to hunt it. The Talons of Silence had long ago abandoned the practice of hunting for sport or sustenance. Now they hunted only knowledge and understanding, seeking to learn about the countless species that filled the galaxy with their noise and chaos. The elk was merely bait, a tool to test the character of the newest arrivals to this sector of space, the humans. She had watched the human male approach the clearing with his clumsy 2-legged gait and his primitive scanning devices. Humans were such fragile things, she thought. No natural weapons, no protective covering except the thin fabric they wrapped around their soft bodies. No enhanced senses to speak of. They should have died out long ago on whatever hostile world had spawned them. Yet somehow they had not only survived but thrived, spreading across the stars with a determination that both impressed and concerned the elder races. The Talons had been monitoring human expansion for decades now, trying to decide whether these newcomers represented a threat or an opportunity. Cathara had seen many species face the test of the sacred elk. Most simply walked past, too absorbed in their own concerns to notice the suffering of another creature. Some noticed but chose not to act, calculating that involvement would bring no benefit to themselves. A few had even tried to put the creature out of its misery, which showed a kind of mercy but not the kind the Talons valued most. Only the rarest beings, those with truly exceptional character, would stop everything to help a stranger in need without any thought of reward or recognition. Cathara had participated in hundreds of these tests across dozens of worlds, and she could count on one clawed hand how many had passed. She watched as the human knelt beside the elk and began speaking to it in soft tones. The words meant nothing to the creature, of course, but the intent behind them was clear. This was not the voice of someone performing a duty or seeking acclaim. This was genuine compassion, the kind that arose from seeing another living being in pain and feeling that pain as if it were your own. Cathara shifted her weight slightly, her talons gripping the branch beneath her with unconscious strength. This was already more promising than most encounters. The cutting began, and Cathara observed every detail. She noted how the human's hands shook from effort but never wavered from their task. She saw the sweat that darkened his clothing and the way he had to keep wiping his eyes to see clearly. She watched as he worked through obvious discomfort and fatigue, never once stopping to question whether this effort was worthwhile. The vines were difficult to cut and the work was tedious, yet the human showed no frustration or impatience. He simply continued, methodical and steady until the job was done. What impressed Cathara most was what happened after the elk was freed. The human did not try to touch it further or claim any acknowledgement for his deed. He did not activate his recording devices to document his heroism. He simply sat back and waited to see if the creature could stand, and when it did, he let it go without any attempt to follow or study it further. The elk disappeared into the forest and the human gathered his things and left. No ceremony, no self-congratulation, no expectation of gratitude, just a quiet satisfaction in having done what needed to be done. Cathara remained in her position long after both the elk and the human had departed. Her mind worked through the implications of what she had witnessed. In her long life spanning over 3 centuries, she had learned that individual actions revealed more about a species than any amount of cultural study or diplomatic interaction. Anyone could put on a pleasant face for visitors or craft beautiful philosophies about compassion and justice. But what people did when they thought no one was watching, when there was nothing to gain and no consequences to fear, that showed their true nature. The human had been alone. He could have walked past without guilt because no one would ever know. He could have documented the elk's suffering for his research without intervening. Instead, he had chosen to spend hours of his time and considerable effort to help a creature that could offer him nothing in return. This was not the behavior of a species driven purely by self-interest or tribal loyalty. This suggested something deeper, something the Talons had been searching for since they first detected human radio signals drifting through space nearly a century ago. Cathara finally moved, spreading her wings and dropping silently from the branch to the forest floor. She was over 7 feet tall when fully upright, with powerful legs ending in talons that could shred metal and a sharp beak capable of tearing through most known materials. Her bronze feathers caught the last rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy, creating patterns that seemed to shift and flow like liquid. She wore no clothing except for the ceremonial bands around her upper arms, markers of her rank within the Talons of Silence. Her people had no need for the trappings other species seemed to find so important. She walked to the spot where the human had knelt and examined the ground carefully. The crushed vegetation, the discarded pieces of severed vine, the drops of sweat that had fallen from the human's face, all told the story of what had transpired here. Cathara reached into the pouch at her side and withdrew a single feather, one of her own primaries that she had shed during the last molting season. It was a deep bronze color with edges that caught light like polished metal. She held it for a moment, considering the weight of what she was about to do. According to the ancient traditions of her people, offering a feather was a sacred act. It represented respect, recognition, and an invitation to further contact. Once given, it could not be taken back without great dishonor. Cathara had lived for 347 years and had given her feathers to only 2 other beings in all that time. Both had proven worthy of the trust she placed in them. Both had become allies to the Talons and to the Greater Galactic Council. Now she was about to make a third offering, to a species that most of the Council still viewed with suspicion and doubt. She encoded the feather with coordinates using a technique that would make the information readable to human technology. Then she took flight, her powerful wings carrying her silently through the darkening sky. She would place the feather where the human would find it, and then she would wait. If he chose to follow the coordinates, that would tell her something important. If he chose to ignore the gift or hand it over to his superiors without investigating personally, that would also tell her something. Either way, the test was not yet complete. The human had shown compassion to a helpless creature, but could he show courage when faced with the unknown? Could he show wisdom when confronted with choices that affected more than just himself? Cathara would soon find out, and with her, all the Talons of Silence would be watching to see what humanity was truly made of deep in its heart. Daniel returned to the research station just after dark, his body aching from the long day and the hours spent kneeling on the hard ground. The station was a modest facility, nothing more than 3 connected modules that housed living quarters, a small laboratory, and storage areas for equipment and supplies. It was home to only 4 researchers, and tonight the halls were quiet as the others had already retired to their rooms. He was grateful for that because he did not want to explain where he had been or why his clothes were torn and stained with that strange, mercury-colored blood. He cleaned himself up in the small bathroom, attached to his quarters, and changed into fresh clothes. His hands were still trembling slightly from the sustained effort of cutting through those vines, and he noticed several small cuts on his palms that he had not felt at the time. He applied medical gel to them and watched as the smart material sealed the wounds and began accelerating the healing process. One of the few luxuries of frontier life was access to good medical technology. Out here, far from hospitals and proper doctors, people needed to be able to treat themselves for most injuries. After changing, Daniel made his way to the small kitchen area and heated a meal packet. The food was bland and processed, but it filled his stomach, and that was all that mattered. He ate quickly, suddenly aware of how hungry he had become. He had skipped lunch entirely, and now his body was demanding fuel. As he ate, he thought about the elk and wondered if it had survived the night. The creature had seemed strong enough when it walked away, but he had no way of knowing if the hours trapped in those vines had caused internal damage that would prove fatal later. He finished eating and tossed the empty container into the recycler, then made his way to his small office to file his daily report. This was going to be tricky. He needed to account for his time and activities, but he did not want to admit that he had broken protocol by interfering with local wildlife. He decided to keep it vague, mentioning that he had explored the northern sector and observed several interesting species but encountered nothing that required immediate documentation. It was not exactly a lie, though it was certainly not the whole truth either. Daniel sat down at his workstation and pulled up the report template on his screen. But before he could start typing, something caught his eye. There on his desk, resting against his keyboard, was a feather. He stared at it for a long moment, trying to understand how it had gotten there. He had locked his office when he left that morning, and the door had still been locked when he returned. The station's security system showed no unauthorized entries. Yet here was this feather, impossible to miss, placed deliberately where he would find it. He picked it up carefully, expecting it to feel like any other feather. light and delicate. Instead, it was warm, almost hot to the touch, and surprisingly heavy. The color was unlike anything he had seen in his 6 months on Kestrel 9. It was bronze, but not a flat uniform shade. Instead, the color seemed to shift and flow as he turned the feather in his hands, creating patterns that reminded him of oil on water. The edges caught the light from his desk lamp and reflected it in a way that seemed wrong, as if the feather was made from metal rather than organic material. Daniel activated his scanning equipment and ran the feather through a full analysis. The results made no sense. The computer identified it as biological in origin, but could not match it to any known species in the database. The structure was similar to avian feathers from Earth, but far more complex, with microscopic channels running through the veins that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. Most puzzling was the temperature reading. The feather was generating heat, not just retaining it from his hand. It was producing energy somehow, though the scanner could not determine the source. He noticed something attached to the quill end of the feather and brought it closer to examine. It was a small crystal, barely larger than a grain of rice, embedded in the shaft. The crystal glowed with a faint blue light and had markings etched into its surface. Daniel connected his scanner to the station's main computer and ran the markings through the translation database. The computer worked for several minutes before producing results. The markings were coordinates, precise locations on the planet's surface deep in the uncharted forest regions. Daniel sat back in his chair and tried to think through what this meant. Someone or something had entered his locked office, left this extraordinary feather, and included coordinates pointing to a specific location. This was clearly not a random occurrence. It was a message, an invitation, or perhaps a trap. He thought about the elk he had saved and wondered if there could be a connection. Had someone witnessed his actions in the forest? Was this feather a reward or a lure to draw him into danger? He heard footsteps in the corridor outside and quickly slipped the feather into his desk drawer. A moment later, there was a knock on his door and Lisa Morgan entered. She was the senior xenobiologist on the station, a woman in her late 40s with gray hair she kept cut short and sharp eyes that missed very little. She had been Daniel's mentor since he arrived, and he respected her judgment more than anyone else he worked with. Lisa glanced at his screen and noticed he had not yet filed his daily report. She raised an eyebrow and asked if everything was all right. Daniel hesitated, then decided to show her the feather. He pulled it from the drawer and placed it on the desk between them. Lisa leaned forward and examined it without touching, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she took in the unusual properties. She asked where he had found it, and Daniel explained how it had appeared on his desk while he was out. He showed her the coordinates embedded in the crystal and watched as her concern deepened into something closer to alarm. Lisa had been on Frontier Worlds for over 20 years and had seen things that did not make it into official reports. She knew that the galaxy was full of dangers that humanity was only beginning to understand. Lisa warned him that this could be a trap set by the Kryn raiders who sometimes ventured into this sector looking for easy targets. The Kryn were a species of scavengers and pirates who had no respect for territory or treaties. They were known to use lures and tricks to draw researchers away from the safety of their stations. She advised Daniel to report the feather to Earth Command and let them decide how to proceed. Going to investigate the coordinates himself would be foolish and potentially fatal. Daniel listened to her warnings and knew she was probably right. The smart thing to do was to hand this over to people with more experience and better resources. But even as he agreed with her logic, he felt a pull toward those coordinates. Something about the feather and the way it had been left for him specifically suggested that this was not a random threat. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to deliver a message and included coordinates for a reason. If they wanted to harm him, there were easier ways to do it than this elaborate setup. He told Lisa he would think about it, and she nodded, though her expression made clear she did not believe him. She reminded him that Frontier researchers had a reputation for taking unnecessary risks, and that reputation existed because too many of them ended up dead. Then she left, closing the door behind her and leaving Daniel alone with the feather and the choice it represented. He sat there for a long time, turning the warm bronze feather in his hands and thinking about wounded elks and the possibility that kindness might be rewarded with something more than just personal satisfaction. Finally, he made his decision and began preparing for a solo expedition into the unknown regions of Kestrel 9. Daniel left the research station before dawn, leaving only a brief message for Lisa explaining that he had gone to investigate the coordinates and would return within a week. He knew she would be angry when she found the message, but he also knew she would not try to stop him or report him to Earth Command, at least not immediately. She understood the pull of discovery that drove people to become xenobiologists in the first place. That same pull had brought her to the frontier decades ago and kept her here, despite opportunities to return to more comfortable positions back on Earth. He carried a pack filled with supplies for 7 days, including food rations, water purification tablets, a portable shelter, medical equipment, and defensive weapons. The weapons were mostly for protection against wildlife, though they would serve equally well against hostile species if necessary. He also carried extensive recording equipment, because whatever he found at those coordinates, he intended to document it properly. Science demanded evidence, and Daniel was still enough of a researcher to respect that requirement, even while breaking numerous safety protocols. The journey began easily enough, following mapped trails through the outer forest regions. The morning air was cool and filled with the sounds of creatures waking to greet the day. Birds that were not quite birds sang melodies that had no equivalent in Earth music. Small mammals that might have been rodents or might have been something else entirely scurried through the underbrush. The trees here were the familiar glowing blue variety that Daniel had come to recognize as the most common species on Kestrel 9. But as he ventured deeper into the wilderness, following the coordinates on his navigation device, the landscape began to change. The blue trees gave way to varieties he had never seen before. Some had bark that looked like polished obsidian and leaves that chimed softly when the wind touched them. Others grew in impossible spirals, their trunks twisting around themselves in patterns that seemed to defy the normal rules of plant growth. The undergrowth became denser and stranger, filled with fungi that glowed in colors that hurt to name, and flowers that opened and closed in response to his footsteps. On the second day, Daniel reached a river that had not appeared on any of the station's maps. The water was not water at all, but some kind of liquid metal, flowing sluggishly between banks of crystallized minerals. It looked like mercury but moved with a different quality, almost as if it was aware of his presence. He spent an hour searching for a safe crossing point before finally finding a series of stepping stones that allowed him to hop across. The stones were warm beneath his boots and hummed with a low frequency that he could feel in his bones. Beyond the river, the forest became even more alien. The trees here were massive, their trunks easily 20 feet in diameter and rising so high that their tops disappeared into a permanent mist that hung over everything. The bark was covered in intricate patterns that looked almost like writing, though Daniel could not determine if they were natural formations or deliberate carvings. The light that filtered down through the canopy was green and gold, creating an underwater quality to the air that made him feel like he was walking through a dream. On the third day, he entered a region where the ground itself was musical. Every step produced a different tone, as if he was walking across an enormous instrument designed by some incomprehensible intelligence. At first it was amusing, then unsettling, and finally almost maddening as the constant melody followed him for hours. He tried to move quietly, but it was impossible. The ground announced his presence with every movement, creating songs that echoed through the forest and attracted the attention of creatures he preferred not to meet. He saw animals that challenged his understanding of biology. Deer-like creatures whose antlers split into fractal patterns that seemed to extend into dimensions he could not quite perceive. Wolves with eyes like miniature galaxies, containing swirls of light and darkness that moved independently of the animal's gaze. Birds whose songs created visible ripples in the air, spreading out in concentric circles that disturbed dust and leaves as they passed. None of these creatures approached him directly, but all of them watched. Daniel had the constant feeling of being observed, evaluated, measured against some standard he could not comprehend. The nights were the hardest part of the journey. Daniel set up his portable shelter and tried to rest, but sleep came in fragments interrupted by strange sounds and stranger silences. Sometimes he heard voices speaking in languages he did not know, though his rational mind insisted it was just the wind moving through odd formations of rock and vegetation. Other times he heard nothing at all, an absence of sound so complete that it felt oppressive, as if the entire forest was holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. On the 5th day, exhausted and questioning his decision to come here, Daniel finally reached a break in the forest. He emerged into a clearing roughly circular in shape and perhaps 100 yards across. The ground here was smooth and flat, covered in short grass that was perfectly uniform in height and color. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, a simple rectangular block of gray rock that looked like it had been placed there deliberately, rather than occurring naturally. Daniel approached cautiously, his hand resting on the grip of his defensive weapon. The clearing felt wrong somehow, too perfect, too deliberately arranged. As he got closer to the altar, he noticed that the ground around it was covered in feathers. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, all identical to the one that had appeared on his desk. They were arranged in a spiral pattern that started at the outer edge of the clearing and wound inward to the altar at the center. Each feather was perfectly placed, creating a design that was both beautiful and unsettling in its precision. He reached the altar and examined it more closely. The stone was covered in the same kind of markings he had seen on the trees, patterns that might have been language or decoration or something else entirely. He placed his hand on the surface and felt a warmth similar to that of the feather. The stone was generating heat, alive in some way that stone should not be. Daniel pulled out his recording equipment and began documenting everything, working methodically despite his exhaustion and the growing sense that he was not alone in this place. That was when he heard the sound of wings. Not the fluttering of small birds, but the powerful sweep of something large moving through air. Daniel turned and saw a figure descending from the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, over 7 feet, with a body covered in bronze feathers and powerful legs ending in wicked talons. The creature landed gracefully on the opposite side of the altar and folded its wings against its back. It stood there watching him with eyes that were disturbingly intelligent and entirely alien. Daniel's first instinct was to run, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way the creature made no aggressive moves. Perhaps it was the recognition that if this being had wanted to harm him, it could have done so at any point during his journey. Or perhaps it was simply that he had come too far to turn back now. He took a deep breath and forced himself to remain calm. The creature tilted its head in a gesture that seemed almost curious and took a step forward. Daniel matched the movement, taking his own step forward. They stood there on opposite sides of the altar, human and alien, separated by a few feet of space and millions of years of evolution, trying to find a way to communicate across a divide that had never been bridged before in this corner of the galaxy. Cathara studied the human standing across from her with an intensity that came from centuries of practice in reading the subtle languages of body and spirit. The human was afraid. She could see that in the tension of his shoulders and the way his hand hovered near his weapon. But he did not flee. Fear paired with courage was a promising combination. It showed the ability to feel appropriate caution while not being controlled by it. She had seen many species react to their first encounter with the talons, and most either attacked in panic or ran without looking back. This human did neither. He stood his ground and met her gaze, waiting to see what would happen next. She raised her hands slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Her people did not communicate through spoken language, at least not in the way most species did. The talons had evolved past the need for crude vocalizations long ago. They spoke through gesture, through posture, through the subtle shifts in feather position and the angle of their heads. But Cathara knew this human would not understand those signals, so she would need to find another way to bridge the gap between their species. She touched a band on her upper arm, one of the ceremonial markers she wore. The band responded to her thought and projected a hologram into the air above the altar. The image showed a planet, green and blue and beautiful, covered in oceans and continents. Daniel recognized it immediately as Earth, though the continents were arranged slightly differently than he remembered from current maps. This was Earth as it had appeared thousands of years ago, before the ice ages and the continental shifts that had reshaped the geography. The image changed, showing figures that looked like early humans gathered around fires and living in simple dwellings. Cathara watched the human's face carefully, noting his recognition and understanding. Good. He was intelligent enough to follow what she was showing him. The hologram continued to evolve, displaying the progression of human civilization through the ages. The rise of cities, the development of agriculture, the invention of tools and weapons, the slow climb from caves to kingdoms to nations. Then the image shifted to show another world, one with red skies and purple vegetation. A different species appeared in the hologram, beings that looked somewhat like large cats but with 6 legs and expressive faces. Cathara showed this species going through similar stages of development, building their own civilizations and facing their own challenges. The human watched with growing fascination as the story unfolded. But then something changed in the hologram. The cat-like beings began to wage war against each other, their conflicts growing more brutal and devastating with each generation. Cities burned and populations were slaughtered. The progression of their civilization stuttered and nearly stopped as they turned their intelligence and creativity toward the perfection of violence. Cathara showed this part of the story without emotion, letting the images speak for themselves. The scene shifted again, and Cathara brought her own people into the narrative. The Talons appeared in the hologram as they had been long ago, before they learned the lessons that shaped them into what they were now. They were conquerors then, moving from world to world and crushing any species that stood in their way. Cathara did not hide this dark history. The human needed to understand what the Talons had been in order to appreciate what they had become. The hologram showed a battle on a world Cathara had never visited but whose story was known to every Talon who lived. Her people had invaded this world and were in the process of destroying its defenders when something unexpected happened. A single being from the defending species, wounded and defeated and with nothing left to lose, had chosen mercy over revenge. This being had found a young Talon trapped in wreckage and instead of killing it, had freed it and tended its wounds. That single act had changed everything. The young Talon had survived and grown and eventually risen to a position of leadership among her people. She had never forgotten the mercy shown to her by an enemy who had every reason to hate. When she gained power, she used it to transform Talon society from the inside. It took generations and countless struggles, but slowly the Talons evolved from predators into protectors. They learned that true strength came not from domination but from restraint, not from taking life but from preserving it. Daniel watched this history unfold with an expression that Cathara found difficult to read, but which seemed to contain elements of both wonder and understanding. She continued the narrative, showing how the Talons had joined with other species to form the Galactic Council, an alliance dedicated to protecting emerging civilizations and preventing the kinds of wars that had nearly destroyed so many promising species. The Council did not rule, it guided. It did not conquer, it assisted. It existed to give young species the time and space they needed to mature past their own violent tendencies. The hologram changed again, and now it showed the elk Daniel had saved. Cathara watched his reaction carefully and saw the moment of recognition in his eyes. She showed him the scene from her own perspective, hidden in the trees as she watched him work for hours to free the trapped creature. She showed him how she had deliberated over what his actions meant. Then she showed him the feather and the coordinates, the invitation that had brought him here. Cathara dismissed the hologram and looked at Daniel directly. She needed him to understand what came next, and for that she required a different approach. She closed her eyes and focused her thoughts, reaching out with a sense that humans did not possess naturally, but which all intelligent species developed eventually if they survived long enough. It was not telepathy exactly, more like a sharing of intent and emotion that transcended the barriers of language and biology. Daniel felt something touch his mind, gentle but undeniable. It was not words or images, but pure meaning flowing directly into his consciousness. He understood with a certainty that bypassed doubt that Cathara was offering humanity something precious and rare. The elk had been a test, a way to measure the character of his species through the actions of one individual. By saving it, Daniel had demonstrated that humans possessed the quality the Council valued most, the ability to show mercy without expectation of reward. The meaning continued to flow, and Daniel learned what the feather represented. It was not just a gift, but a key, an invitation for humanity to join the Galactic Council as a junior member. Acceptance would bring access to technologies that would accelerate human development by thousands of years. It would bring trade agreements and cultural exchanges. It would bring protection from species like the Kryn who preyed on isolated civilizations. But it would also bring responsibilities. Humans would be bound by Council laws and subject to Council judgments. They would be expected to contribute to the defense of weaker species and to uphold the principles that had brought the Council into being. Cathara opened her eyes and the connection faded, leaving Daniel with a mind full of implications and possibilities. She reached into a pouch at her side and produced another object, a small crystal similar to the one that had held the coordinates. She placed it on the altar between them. Through gesture and the lingering connection, she made her meaning clear. This crystal would allow Daniel to communicate with the council directly. He could take it back to his people and they could decide together whether to accept the invitation. But there was a condition, and Cathara needed to be absolutely certain Daniel understood it. The decision could not be rushed or made out of fear or greed. Humanity would have one lunar cycle to consider the offer. At the end of that time, Daniel would return to this clearing with an answer. If humanity chose to accept, the council would welcome them and begin the process of integration. If humanity chose to refuse, the council would respect that decision and leave them to develop on their own timeline, uncontacted and unprotected but free. Cathara picked up the crystal and held it out toward Daniel. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward and taking it from her talons. The crystal was warm, like the feather, and it seemed to pulse with a soft light in response to his touch. Daniel looked up at Cathara and spoke, even though he knew she could not understand his words in the conventional sense. He thanked her for the gift and promised to bring her an answer that truly reflected the best of what humanity could be. Cathara understood his intent, if not his specific words. She placed a clawed hand over her chest in a gesture of respect, then spread her wings and launched herself into the air. Daniel watched as she circled once overhead before disappearing into the forest, leaving him alone in the clearing with a crystal that held the future of his entire species in its small, glowing form. Daniel remained in the clearing for a long time after Cathara departed, trying to process everything he had witnessed and experienced. The crystal in his hand felt heavier than its physical weight could account for, as if it was loaded with the accumulated gravity of all the decisions it represented. He sat down on the grass near the altar and let his mind work through the implications of what he had just learned. Humanity was being invited to join something vast and ancient, something that could reshape the entire future of his species. And somehow, impossibly, he had become the messenger who would carry this invitation back to Earth. He activated his recording equipment and began documenting everything, speaking his observations and thoughts aloud so they would be preserved. He described Cathara in detail, noting her height and the bronze color of her feathers and the intelligence in her eyes. He described the holographic history she had shared with him, the rise and fall and transformation of the Talons from conquerors to protectors. He tried to put into words the feeling of that brief mental connection, the way pure meaning had flowed between them without the need for language. But as he spoke, Daniel realized the inadequacy of his recordings. How could he make people understand what it felt like to stand before an alien being and truly know that you were being judged not just as an individual, but as a representative of your entire species? How could he convey the weight of carrying a message that would determine whether humanity spent the next 1,000 years in isolation or in community with the greater galaxy? He did his best, knowing it would never be enough, but hoping it would at least begin to communicate the significance of this moment. When he finished recording, Daniel carefully placed the crystal in a protective case and secured it in his pack. Then he began the long journey back to the research station. The trip that had taken 5 days to complete the first time now seemed to pass in a blur. His mind was too occupied with thoughts of the council and Cathara, and the choice that lay ahead to pay much attention to his surroundings. He navigated by instinct and training, his feet following the path while his thoughts ranged across light years and centuries. He reached the research station late on the 3rd day of his return journey. Lisa was waiting for him in the common area, her expression a mixture of relief and anger. She demanded to know where he had been and whether he had any idea how worried she had been. Daniel apologized and asked her to gather the other researchers. What he had to tell them was too important to repeat multiple times. Lisa studied his face for a long moment, seeing something there that made her swallow her anger. She nodded and went to collect the others. An hour later, all 4 researchers sat in the station's small conference room. Daniel stood at the front with his recording equipment connected to the display screen. He began by showing them the feather and explaining how it had appeared on his desk. Then he played the recordings of his journey and his encounter with Cathara. The room fell silent as the holographic images played, showing Earth's history and the Talon's transformation, and finally the invitation that had been extended to humanity. When the recordings ended, the silence stretched for a long time. Finally, Lisa spoke. She asked the question that was probably on everyone's mind. Was this real? Could they trust that this alien being was telling the truth about the Council and its intentions? What if this was an elaborate trick, some kind of trap designed to make humanity lower its guard? Daniel had no answer that would satisfy those doubts completely. All he could say was that Cathara had showed him her people's darkest history as readily as their achievements. If this was a deception, it was one that included admissions of past evil that seemed unnecessary. The discussion continued for hours as the researchers debated what to do next. Some argued for immediate acceptance, pointing out the benefits of gaining access to advanced technology and the protection of the Council. Others urged caution, suggesting that independence might be worth more than the security of alliance. Eventually, they agreed that this decision was far too large for 4 Frontier researchers to make. Daniel needed to contact Earth Command immediately and let the proper authorities handle the situation. Daniel composed a detailed message summarizing everything that had happened and attached all his recordings and scans. He knew the message would take weeks to reach Earth because of the communication lag across interstellar distances. Then he would have to wait weeks more for a response. But there was no way to speed up the process. This was the reality of Frontier life. You were always operating with outdated information and delayed responses. Sometimes by the time Earth sent instructions, the situation had already changed completely. He sent the message, and then there was nothing to do but wait. Days turned into weeks, and life at the research station fell into an uneasy routine. Daniel tried to continue his normal work, but found it difficult to focus on cataloging plants and analyzing soil samples when the future of humanity hung in the balance. The other researchers treated him differently now, with a mixture of respect and wariness. He had become something more than a colleague. He was the human who had made first contact with an advanced alien species, the one who carried a crystal that could speak to the Galactic Council. When the response from Earth Command finally arrived, it was not what Daniel expected. Instead of instructions or orders, the message contained questions, dozens of them, pages upon pages of detailed inquiries about every aspect of his encounter with Cathara. The military wanted to know about Talon capabilities and potential vulnerabilities. The scientists wanted more information about the Council's technology and the nature of the invitation. The politicians wanted to understand the exact terms and whether they could be negotiated. Daniel answered as best he could, but many of the questions required information he simply did not have. He had spent perhaps an hour with Cathara, and most of that time had been spent absorbing the holographic history and understanding the basic terms of the offer. He had not thought to ask about military capabilities or technological specifications. He was a xenobiologist, not a diplomat or a soldier. He had done his best to document what happened, but he had not been prepared for the role that events had thrust upon him. More messages followed, and with them came instructions. Daniel was to remain on Kestrel 9 and await further developments. A diplomatic team was being assembled and would be dispatched to his location, but it would take months for them to arrive. In the meantime, he was to have no further contact with the Talons unless absolutely necessary. If Cathara appeared again, he was to document the encounter, but make no commitments on behalf of humanity. The weeks continued to pass, and Daniel watched the deadline approach. Cathara had given humanity 1 lunar cycle to decide, and that time was running out. He calculated that the diplomatic team would not arrive in time to meet the deadline even if they left immediately, which they probably had not. The decision about what to tell Cathara was going to fall on him after all, despite Earth Command's instructions to wait. The night before the deadline, Daniel barely slept. He lay in his bunk thinking about everything that had happened, and everything that might happen depending on the choice he made. If he asked for more time, would the Council grant it, or would they view the request as a sign of human indecision? If he accepted the invitation without proper authority, would Earth honor his commitment or repudiate it? If he refused, would humanity lose this opportunity forever, or would the Council return at some future time when humans were better prepared? He thought about the elk he had saved, and the chain of events that simple act had started. At the time, it had seemed like such a small thing, helping one injured creature. Now it had grown into something vast and complex, a test that an entire species had passed without knowing they were being evaluated. Cathara had seen compassion in that moment and decided it was worth extending an invitation. Daniel hoped that he could show the same wisdom in making his choice as he had shown mercy in that forest clearing. Morning came, and Daniel rose early. He gathered his equipment and the crystal Cathara had given him. He told Lisa where he was going, and she did not try to stop him. She simply wished him luck and reminded him that whatever he decided, he had done more than anyone could have expected. Daniel thanked her and set out for the clearing where Cathara was waiting to hear humanity's answer to a question that would echo across the stars for generations to come. The message that Daniel sent to Earth Command arrived during what would later be remembered as one of the most tumultuous periods in human history. It appeared on screens across the communication networks of United Earth, bypassing normal channels because of its priority classification. Within hours, everyone who mattered in human government, military, and scientific circles had seen the recordings of Daniel's encounter with Cathara. Within days, the entire human population knew that humanity had been invited to join something called the Galactic Council. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Every news network ran the story constantly, showing the holographic images Cathara had shared and interviewing experts who tried to explain what this might mean. Religious leaders debated whether the existence of the council supported or contradicted various theological positions. Philosophers discussed the implications of humanity no longer being alone in a meaningful sense. Economists tried to calculate the potential benefits and costs of joining an interstellar alliance. Everyone had an opinion and everyone wanted to be heard. Admiral Helen Price called an emergency meeting of Earth's Frontier Defense Command. She was a career military officer who had spent 40 years rising through the ranks and had seen humanity expand from 3 planets to nearly 20 settled worlds. She was practical, experienced, and not given to emotional decisions. She studied the recordings Daniel had sent multiple times, analyzing every frame for information about Talon capabilities and council structure. What she saw both impressed and concerned her. The technology Cathara had displayed so casually, the holographic projectors and the mental communication and the feathers that generated their own heat, all of it represented advancements that humanity would not achieve for decades or perhaps centuries. If the Talons were an average member of the Council, then humanity was dealing with civilizations that were far beyond human capabilities. That could be an opportunity or a threat depending on the Council's true intentions. Admiral Price argued strongly for acceptance, pointing out that humanity needed allies and protection. The galaxy was larger and more dangerous than most people realized, and going it alone was a recipe for eventual disaster. But others disagreed. Governor Paul Henderson represented the independent colonies, settlements that had been founded by people who left Earth specifically to escape centralized authority. He was suspicious of any organization that claimed to operate for the greater good, having seen too many examples of such organizations becoming corrupt or tyrannical over time. He pointed out that the Council's invitation came with strings attached. Humans would be bound by laws they had no part in creating, and subject to judgments made by beings who might not understand or care about human values. He argued that freedom was worth more than security, and that humanity should refuse the invitation. The debate spread from government chambers to homes and workplaces across human space. Families argued over dinner about whether to trust these aliens. Co-workers debated whether the benefits of advanced technology outweighed the loss of autonomy. Students wrote papers analyzing the question from every possible angle. The discussion consumed human society completely, pushing aside all other concerns as people grappled with the most important decision their species had ever faced. Daniel found himself at the center of this storm, despite being millions of miles away on a frontier world. His face appeared on every news broadcast and his words were analyzed by countless commentators. Some people hailed him as a hero who had opened the door to humanity's future among the stars. Others criticized him for exceeding his authority and making promises that might be impossible to keep. He received thousands of messages, some expressing gratitude and others containing threats. The attention was overwhelming, and he quickly learned to avoid reading most of it. Dr. Lisa Morgan helped him prepare a presentation for the emergency session of the United Earth Parliament that had been called to discuss the Council's invitation. She coached him on how to speak clearly and concisely, how to present the facts without speculation, and how to remain neutral when asked about his personal opinion. Daniel practiced for hours, knowing that what he said in that session would influence the decision that ultimately got made. He had never wanted this kind of responsibility, and would have gladly handed it to someone more qualified, but events had made that impossible. The Parliament session was broadcast live across all of human space. Daniel appeared via video link, his image projected onto a massive screen in the chamber where hundreds of representatives sat in curved rows facing the podium. He walked them through his encounter with Cathara step by step, showing the recordings and answering questions as honestly as he could. Some representatives were hostile, suggesting that he had been deceived or manipulated. Others were enthusiastic, asking detailed questions about council technology and culture. Most simply seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were being asked to decide. Admiral Price spoke in favor of acceptance, making a compelling case for the strategic benefits of alliance. She presented intelligence reports about hostile species like the Kryn and explained how vulnerable humanity was to external threats. The council offered protection, and that alone might be worth the price of membership. Governor Henderson spoke against acceptance, warning about the loss of sovereignty and the risk of becoming subordinate to alien interests. He painted a vision of humanity standing alone, free and independent, mastering the galaxy on its own terms. The debate continued for days, with representatives presenting arguments that ranged from practical to philosophical to emotional. Some spoke about the moral obligation to join a community dedicated to protecting weaker species. Others worried about the cultural impact of exposure to more advanced civilizations. Still others focused on the economic implications, calculating potential gains from trade and technology transfer. The Parliament chamber became a microcosm of the larger debate happening across all of human civilization. Public opinion was divided almost evenly. Surveys showed that roughly half of humanity favored acceptance, while the other half preferred independence. The division did not follow traditional political or geographic lines. People from Earth and people from the colonies were equally split. Young and old, rich and poor, educated and working class, all had strong opinions that did not correlate with their demographic categories. This was not a question where ideology provided easy answers. As the deadline approached, it became clear that the Parliament would not reach a consensus in time. The representatives were too divided and the stakes were too high for a quick decision. Some argued for asking the council for an extension, more time to study the offer and consider all the implications. Others insisted that asking for more time would make humanity look weak and indecisive. The arguments went in circles with no resolution in sight. Daniel watched all of this unfold with growing anxiety. Cathara had given humanity one lunar cycle to decide, and that time was almost up. He had followed Earth Command's instructions to wait for the diplomatic team, but it was becoming obvious that no team would arrive in time. The decision was going to fall on him after all, despite everyone's efforts to avoid that outcome. He was a xenobiologist who had made a simple choice to help an injured animal. Now somehow he had become the person who would speak for all of humanity in response to an invitation from the stars. The night before the deadline, Daniel received a private message from Admiral Price. She wrote that the Parliament was hopelessly deadlocked and that no decision would be forthcoming. Daniel was on the ground and had established a relationship with Cathara, however brief. The Admiral was giving him discretionary authority to respond to the Council's invitation as he saw fit. She emphasized that whatever he decided, Earth Command would support him. The weight of humanity would stand behind his choice. Daniel read the message 3 times, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he was being asked to do. Then he archived it, gathered his equipment, and prepared to return to the clearing where Cathara would be waiting for an answer that would determine whether humanity spent its future among the stars or alone in the dark. Daniel arrived at the clearing just as the sun reached its highest point in the sky. He had timed his journey carefully, wanting to arrive during full daylight rather than at dawn or dusk when shadows might make communication more difficult. The clearing looked exactly as it had during his first visit, the spiral of feathers still perfectly arranged around the stone altar and the grass still unnaturally uniform in its height and color. But this time he was not alone. Cathara stood at the far edge of the clearing, and with her were 3 other Talons. The additional talons were similar to Cathara in basic structure, but each had distinct differences. One had feathers that were darker, almost black with hints of deep red. Another was slightly smaller with silver streaks through its bronze plumage. The third was larger than Cathara, with scars visible on its arms and face that spoke of long experience and many battles. All four watched him with those unsettling amber eyes as he walked slowly toward the altar. He could feel the weight of their collective attention and knew that what he said in the next few minutes would echo across more worlds than he could imagine. Daniel stopped at the altar and placed his hand on the warm stone surface. He had thought long and hard about what to say and how to say it. He had written and discarded dozens of speeches, each attempting to capture the complexity of humanity's position and the reasoning behind whatever choice he made. But in the end, he realized that Cathara had not shown him elaborate philosophies or complex political arguments. She had shown him actions and let those actions speak for themselves. He would do the same. He pulled the feather from his pack, the one that Cathara had left on his desk all those weeks ago. It was still warm and still shifted colors in the light. He held it up so all four talons could see it clearly. Then he spoke, knowing that Cathara would understand his intent even if the specific words meant nothing. His voice was steady and clear, and every word was being recorded and transmitted back to Earth, where billions of humans were watching and waiting to learn what their representative had decided. Daniel said that humanity accepted the invitation to join the Galactic Council. He explained that this decision did not come from fear of being alone or from greed for technology and power. It came from the same impulse that had made him spend hours cutting vines to free a wounded elk. Humans were not perfect, he acknowledged. They had a long history of violence and mistakes and short-sightedness. They had hurt each other and damaged their own world through ignorance and selfishness. But they also had the capacity to learn and grow and change. They could see suffering and choose to help even when helping brought no personal benefit. He spoke about the debate that had consumed humanity over the past weeks. He admitted that his people were divided and uncertain, that many feared what joining the council might mean for their independence and their identity. But he argued that the ability to doubt and question was itself a strength. Humanity did not want to join the council because they had all the answers. They wanted to join because they recognized how much they still had to learn. They were willing to be bound by laws they had not written and judged by standards they had not set because they believed those laws and standards represented something worth aspiring to. Daniel paused and looked directly at Cathara. He said that the elk had been healed and was running free somewhere in the forests of this world, unaware that its salvation had sparked something far greater than itself. In the same way, humanity wanted the chance to be part of something greater than themselves. They wanted to help protect the weak and guide the lost and stand against those who would use strength to harm, rather than defend. They were ready to learn from species with more experience and more wisdom. They were ready to contribute what they could and accept help when they needed it. They were ready to be part of a community that spanned the stars. He held the feather higher and said that humanity accepted the eagle feather and all it represented. They would honor the trust that Cathara had placed in them when she witnessed that act of simple kindness. They would strive to be worthy of membership in the council and to uphold the principles that had transformed the Talons from conquerors into protectors. It would not be easy, and there would certainly be mistakes along the way. But humanity had always been at its best when striving toward something difficult, rather than settling for something comfortable. This was their choice, made freely and with full awareness of the responsibility it entailed. Cathara stepped forward and Daniel felt that familiar touch on his mind, that sense of meaning flowing directly into his consciousness. What he received was not words but a feeling of recognition and respect. Cathara had hoped for this answer but had not been certain she would receive it. Humanity had passed the first test, but there would be many more ahead. The council did not admit new members lightly, and humans would need to prove themselves repeatedly in the years to come. But the door was open now and the invitation had been accepted. The rest would depend on choices that millions of humans would make in situations, large and small, across the coming decades. Cathara placed a clawed hand over Daniel's heart in the gesture of recognition he had seen before. Then she reached into a pouch and pulled out a collection of feathers, not bronze like hers, but in many different colors. Each feather represented one of the council races that had voted to accept humanity's petition for membership. There were dozens of them, speaking to the diversity and scope of the organization humanity was joining. Cathara arranged them carefully on the altar while the other 3 Talons watched in silence. Then something happened that Daniel had not expected. The 4 Talons began to sing. It was not music in any way he had heard before. Their voices produced harmonics that seemed to resonate with the air itself, creating visible patterns of sound that spread out across the clearing like ripples on a pond. The grass responded to the singing, glowing with soft light that pulsed in rhythm with the harmonics. The feathers on the altar lifted into the air and began to orbit around each other in complex patterns that defied simple physics. The song continued for several minutes, and Daniel stood transfixed, watching something that he knew few humans had ever witnessed. This was not a performance for his benefit. This was a ceremony, a ritual the Talons performed to mark important moments and transitions. He was being honored with a glimpse into their culture, a sign of acceptance that went beyond the formal agreements and political considerations. When the song finally ended, the feathers settled back onto the altar and the glow faded from the grass. The clearing fell silent except for the normal sounds of the forest around them. Cathara gestured toward the sky and Daniel looked up. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the blue-green dome of Kestrel 9's atmosphere and a few distant clouds. But then he noticed shapes moving high above, descending slowly through the upper atmosphere. Ships, dozens of them, each one different in design and size. They were approaching Earth's solar system, bearing delegates from across the Council who had been waiting for humanity's answer before making their presence known. Daniel watched the ships grow larger as they descended and knew that everything was about to change. First contact was no longer a theoretical discussion or a diplomatic negotiation. It was happening right now, in the space above his head and on worlds across human civilization. In the coming days and weeks, humans would meet beings from dozens of species. They would begin learning about technologies and philosophies and ways of life that would challenge everything they thought they knew. It would be overwhelming and difficult and occasionally frightening, but it would also be magnificent. He thought about the elk, healed and running free through alien forests. He thought about the choice he had made to help it, not because anyone was watching or because he expected any reward, but simply because it was the right thing to do. That choice had led to this moment, standing in a clearing on a distant world while ships from across the galaxy descended to welcome humanity into a community that spanned the stars. He had been afraid that one person's actions could never matter in the vastness of space. Now he understood that sometimes one person's actions were exactly what mattered most. The sun was beginning to set, painting the clearing in shades of orange and gold. Cathara and the other Talons spread their wings and prepared to depart. But before they left, Cathara touched Daniel's mind one last time. The meaning she shared was simple but profound. She showed him the elk again, healthy and strong, and then she showed him humanity spreading across the galaxy in the centuries to come, learning and teaching and growing into something greater than they had been. The silent hunter who had tested them with an injured animal was now welcoming them as equals, as partners in the ancient work of protecting life and nurturing growth wherever it arose. Cathara and her companions launched themselves into the air and circled once overhead before flying away toward the setting sun. Daniel stood alone in the clearing for a long time, watching the ships continue their descent and thinking about what came next. Then he gathered the feathers from the altar, precious gifts from species he had not yet met, and began the journey back to the research station. Behind him, the clearing grew dark as night fell.